Welcome everybody to a Center on PBIS webinar on equitable classroom acknowledgement systems. My name is Kent McIntosh. I am a professor at the University of Oregon and co-director of the Center on Positive Behavioral Interventions and Supports, or PBIS. And with me presenting, I am very lucky, and you all are very lucky to have Dr. Maria Reina Santiago Rosario, who is at the University of Oregon and a partner with the center. So we're going to be talking about classroom acknowledgement. And as we get started, speaking of acknowledgements, I would like to start with a land acknowledgement. And you are welcome to, if you would like to add in the chat acknowledgement for the land that you are on. But Maria and I, and Austin, who is supporting us on the tech side, are living on Kalapuya Ilihi, which is the traditional indigenous territories of the Kalapuya peoples. Following treaties between 1851 and 1855, the Kalapuya peoples were forcefully dispossessed of their land and moved to the Coast Reservation in Western Oregon. Today, descendants of the Kalapuya are members of the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians and Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde, and continue to make important contributions to this area and to the world. I also want to acknowledge the equity work group for the Center on PBIS. We've been going on about 7 years in this work of really working to make systems for PBIS more equitable and providing resources for doing that. So some of the work you're going to see might come from Maria or me, but a lot of it is from this work group right here. So if you know any of them, please do reach out and thank them. This is the iteration for this year. And then just to get a sense of who is joining us live in this webinar, we're going to open up a poll here, and there are 2 questions. One of them is, what is the level that you're in? And then number 2 is, what is your role? And you can answer, because we often fill multiple hats, you can actually click multiple boxes in there as well, or you can just do the one that is primary for you. So I'll give you a little moment to respond to that. We've got a really nice dispersion across that first one right here. So I'm going to end this poll in just about 5 seconds. So if you're interested in contributing, now is your chance. And so jump on in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right. And then just to show everybody here, if you want to take a look, we've got pretty even distribution across school district, region, state, and federal. And then we've got much more in the trainer or coach, either at the state or at the district level. So that is great. We are going to do everything that we can to reach each one of those areas. But we are going to have a little bit more of a focus on the classroom and supporting in the classroom. So speaking of that and getting us a little bit grounded, because we have a short amount of time for this webinar, we're going to lay out a few assumptions about you as an audience member. So number 1, we're going to assume that you know something about PBIS, that you understand the framework itself, and that you also have at least a basic understanding of classroom PBIS systems. If you don't, we've got links up here, and the slides will be available with the recording when it goes on pbis.org. And these are videos actually from the PBIS National Leadership Forum that just happened. And so you can find those up there. We're also going to make a few assumptions that you know something about equity in school discipline. You know the extent of the challenge that we have in front of us in terms of particularly racial equity in school discipline, and that you're attending because you're interested or committed to this work. And so if you want a little bit of prerequisite or background information, please watch the videos that are on the link up there. And as we do this, we know that there are going to be more people attending this via recording afterwards. But just for those who are joining us live, Your audio and video are going to be off throughout the session. You will not be able to raise your hand. And so if you want to interact with us, there's two ways of doing that. So you can find your Zoom screen. Number one is you may chat, and you will want to click either chat with all attendees, or if you want to chat with the presenters, or if you want to chat with either of us specifically, just make sure to change that drop down when you do your chat. And then if you've got specific questions that you would like us to answer toward the end of the session, you can use that Q&A button and click, and you can add those there, and we'll be really looking at that much more closely. All right, so here's what we're going to do with the short time that we have. I'm going to talk a little bit about the concepts of equity and cultural responsiveness, specifically within a PBIS approach. I'm going to talk a little bit about equity in access to classroom acknowledgement. And then Maria is going to take it from there and talk about how do we actually change our systems to make them more culturally responsive. And then we'll save a few minutes at the end for Q&A as well. And there's the link for the handouts, and you'll be able to find those in the School Climate Transformation Grant topic as well. So the littlest bit of background when we're thinking about school-wide PBIS and classroom PBIS, we want to think about some key core practices. So number one, we define what we want students to be able to do when they leave our buildings, how we want them to interact pro-socially with each other, and what we actually want to teach in terms of the social curriculum. Then, instead of just assuming that if we tell them what it is, they're going to do it, we teach and practice those. And a key component is acknowledging students when they do it the way that we would like for them to do it, or a way that we think is pro-social. If they don't, then we want to respond instructionally as opposed to simply excluding students. And then the last one, we want to make decisions based on data as opposed to hunches, or as opposed to our snap decisions about what we think needs to happen. So how this relates to equity in school discipline, if you go to our equity page on pbis.org, so just go to topics and then down to equity, one of the first things you'll see here is this 5-point intervention approach for increasing equity in school discipline. We know that this is a complex challenge. And so we know that there's no one quick fix or not one grab and go strategy that you can pull out of a hat and pull it off. So instead of doing that, we think about 5 big areas of this. Number one, that we always, when we're looking at data, we look at disaggregated data. Number two, that when we select a behavior framework, we use one that's preventive, that's instructional in nature, that's multi-tiered, and then is adaptable to fit the needs, values, and strengths of our students, their families, and the communities from which they come. Engaging academic instruction, policy work, and then strategies for neutralizing implicit bias. So what we're going to unpack here is this number 2 right here, looking at that culture responsive behavior framework. And in doing that, what we want to do is we want to give you a few definitions of how we're framing this work. And we're not arguing that this is the sole set of definitions, but we think it's particularly useful when we think about classroom systems, and particularly about acknowledgement systems, that we provide this distinction between equity and evidence-based practices and cultural responsiveness. And of course, in reality, there is a good deal of overlap, but we want to try to be a little bit precise, because what you do strategy-wise will actually depend on what you are trying to do. And we're hoping that you actually are looking at both of those. So on the left side, when we look at equity and evidence-based practices, what we're really talking about is equitable access to existing evidence-based practices. That's what EBP stands for. So that when we have identified the strategies that we're going to use, and we identify the frameworks we're going to use, we make sure that the access to that is equitable, meaning that students get what they need, not equal, right? But equitable to be able to give that, that access. And the two things that we're going to often focus on, just because that's where the research pulls us, is number one, behavior-specific praise. And then number two, opportunities to respond. And those opportunities to respond, primarily, we're talking about academic opportunities to respond. These are really two incredibly pivotal evidence-based practices, or sometimes people call them evidence-based strategies, that we know from decades and decades of research are really important for student engagement, improved student outcomes, more of what we want to see and less of what we don't want to see. So think about that in terms of how much are we delivering of the things we've all agreed that we're going to do. And then that's a little contrasted with this idea of cultural responsiveness. We're actually adapting what we're going to implement, or implement things that are adaptable, so that it can have better contextual fit with our students, with their families, with communities, and also with our staff and our school personnel communities as well. And when we think about cultural responsiveness, I think it's pretty easy for us to think of that as kind of one thing, or for it to be really amorphous. And so what we try to do is we've looked at, and Maria has done a really nice job of looking at this research and identifying what are the parts that we can adapt for cultural responsiveness. So you can see this one list here. They start at the top from kind of easier to adapt, and then all the way down to sort of bigger lifts, but maybe not necessarily harder or less desirable, but just takes a little bit more work and thought. So it's like really easy to change the language of what we do. It's really easy to change visual representations in the examples that we use. But when we start saying we're going to change some of the ways that we teach, we're actually going to have students and families more involved and have choice, or we're going to involve students and families as co-creators of the systems for behavior support. So hold on to those ideas. I'm going to talk about the ones in green, and Maria is going to go purple here. The other thing that we want to have guide us is some of the existing research on parts of PBIS that are more related to equity in school discipline, specifically racial equity in exclusionary school discipline, particularly for Black students and all other students. And because we don't pick that because that was predetermined for us, we picked that because that's the most common pattern across the US. So that's why we're focusing there. So there have been a couple of teams that have looked at research on parts of PBIS and which parts are more related. And these are different teams from different states using different databases and different measures of fidelity of implementation. And so here are the things that have been found. Number one, that the more schools use data, school teams use data for decision-making, the greater equity in school discipline. Number two, the higher implementation of classroom systems, not just school-wide, but in the classroom, the better equity in school discipline. And that is why we're focusing on classroom here. But it's also really good to know that fidelity of implementation in the classrooms is actually predictive not only of racial equity in school discipline, but overall improvements in student outcomes and sustained implementation. So that's something to think about too. But then specifically within classroom systems, both of these groups found the higher fidelity of implementation or formal acknowledgement or reward systems in schools, the greater equity in school discipline. So that makes us sort of think a little bit about, we spend a lot of time thinking about the discipline gap, but maybe there's an acknowledgement gap, and maybe there are inequities, right, in our use of this evidence-based practice of acknowledging students or using behavior-specific praise or ways to increase positive feedback for students. And so some of the work that's guiding me as a former English teacher, this guy right here, Alex Haley, who wrote a couple of books that were formative for me, one of the things he said, this was in an interview, he talked about his writing, but he said, as much as I could, I tried to find the good and praise it, right? So if we're looking for behavior that we want to increase, we're going to see more of it. And that is why we're spending the whole chunk of this hour specifically on that system, the systems in classrooms for acknowledging pro-social behavior. So I'm going to walk you through some of the details. Anybody know any students like this? There's a sign in a gardening store. My guess is you might have students who act like that, or who are saying that they don't like it, but it could be just the way that we're providing that behavior specific praise to students. I don't think that there are really students who thrive on neglect. There are ones for whom we need to figure out what are the kinds of descriptive feedback or attention that they would actually like to have. Because we know critically, both in schools and specifically, actually, this came from relationship research, that a 5-to-1 ratio of positive or neutral to corrective statements is critically important. There's some research, Paul Caldarella and colleagues have looked at those ratios of positive to negative comments from teachers in the classroom, strong predictors of student outcomes. But that actually came from John Gottman in relationship therapy. They would go around and count couples and their praise to corrections ratios, and lo and behold, that 5-to-1 ratio was the strongest predictor of whether couples would be together years down the road. So kind of interesting there. So what I'd like you to do for a moment is just join me in a little bit of a thought experiment to kind of get us rolling along. And what I'd like you to do is just get a piece of paper out, or pull out a note on your phone if you want, or on your laptop. And what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to list the 5 students. Now, this could be right now in your classrooms. This could be, the last time you were in a classroom, or you could think about who are you working with right now, okay? Or it could be all time. 5 students with whom you had the best or easiest student-teacher relationships with. So I'll give you a moment to do that. Think in your head. You can jot them down. All right. Then, now, what I'd like you to do is list the 5 students with whom you have the most challenging relationships. And so it could be worst relationships, or it could be more difficult, that you really have to work at it to make that relationship positive, or you're still trying to find ways to work at it to make it positive because it still feels pretty negative, or, not working very well. And then when you do that, and you're welcome, if you're watching afterwards, to pause and think about this throughout. And so you're welcome to do that. What I'd like you to do now is just look at this list of 5 students on the best, easiest side, and then look at the 5 students on the most challenging side. And just note, you don't have to write this in the chat or anything, but note, what are some of the patterns that you see? Are there some similarities in terms of visible group identification for the best, easiest, and the most challenging? And it's not true for everybody, but most people, when they do this activity, they find it is easier to build relationships with students with whom you share a common background, with whom you share common interests, with whom you share common appreciations of art, of music, of popular culture. And it's harder when we don't have those connections, or we can't rely on sort of a shared history, perhaps, of experiences. And so when you start looking at this, when you start looking at the teaching population and you start looking at the student population, you might just inherently have a mismatch in terms of, and you likely do, in terms of the race or ethnicity or cultural backgrounds of your teachers and of your students. And so that might mean that we've got to work a lot harder for students who visibly look different from us and have really different learning histories from us. So in terms of some of the research out there, right, I've been talking about this behavior-specific praise as really critical. And so one of the questions that we have is this used equitably with all student groups? And you might be wondering about that based on your list, or you might be just thinking about it in general. Well, there's plenty of really, really recent research that says, as a group, Black or African-American students receive lower rates of praise and higher rates of reprimands across multiple recent studies. So one thing that is really good to know is that individual coaching of teachers can actually increase the equity in praise and reprimands that we see. So that's a really, really good thing for us to know and understand, that there would be, without any intervention, there are most likely to be differences, but we can actually change it through coaching. So I'm going to move us to, I'm going to introduce one particular strategy really quickly, and then Maria is going to go through the rest of those and see how far we get down the line. So I'm going to talk about how we assess and increase our equity in use of this evidence-based practice of acknowledgement or praise with students. And I'm going to share with you a tool if you haven't seen it. It's called Be Positive. It is an app that you can install on your phone, whether it be Android or whether it be an Apple product or an iOS product. And so you can find out about it on PBIS, but I'm just going to describe it to you here. So here's the app, here's the icon for it. And then when you click on it, you get these apps that are all here to help you increase your rates of positive descriptive feedback or behavior-specific praise with students. And there are a few ways that you can do that in there. So number one, you can click this little reminder micro app. And then in there, it comes pre-installed with opportunities to respond to specific praise, those evidence-based practices or evidence-based strategies. And what you can do is you can set a reminder and you can change in here how long you want it to basically ping you. But you can add any ones you want. And so let's start thinking about our equity in praise and think about a student, and you click that plus button. And so maybe I want to say, you know what, it's not just I don't want to increase my overall rate of specific praise. I really want to increase my rates of specific praise for a particular student. Maybe it's a student I don't have a good relationship with, or I have a lot of negatives with, or is from a group that I know is marginalized and experiencing mistreatment and might really feel minoritized in and outside of school. All right, so I've set this up, specific praise for Sean, and then I can click whether I want it to happen on the dot or whether I want it to happen on an average, and I can click how often I want to do that, and I can start it, and it will ping me however I want. So if my phone is set for silent reminders, it'll buzz. It'll show up on the screen if you have your ringer on. Let's say you were, born before I was, then maybe you've got a really loud ring to it. I don't know. And so you can also click here for the counter, and you can click up and down. And in this session, you can also drop down a little bit and actually collect your rates of specific praise. And then you can have multiple ones going at the same time. So here I am with specific praise for Sean once every 5 minutes. And then I also have specific praise once every 2 minutes. And Sean's is as variable, and everybody else's, every 2 minutes, I'm going to get pinged to find a student. And then there are a few other ways of doing it. So you can also use a counter without a reminder if you want to do it, or let's say you're coaching or you're peer coaching and you want to be able to go collect some data. So you just go through and you can do any counters you want. and click through, and you can do it just like that. You can actually have multiple behaviors that you're looking at once if you're doing a classroom visit. And then if there are specific times that you want to remember to use it, you can use this pre-correction alarm. So here's an example. I am implementing the evidence-based practice of greeting students at the door. And I know that I'm going to do that at 7:25 every morning, Monday through Friday. I do not want to get pinged on Saturday and Sunday. So I just set for those specific days. And then I could set any other time that I want to. So here in this case, I'm going to take my calming breaths, right? I'm going to use my neutralizing routine before I go into that school board meeting. But you can add anything else you want in there. And then, of course, you can look at your data and you can look at your progress over time. You can click a button and you can send that directly to a classroom teacher you just observed. You can send it to your coach. You can send it to your pet, whatever. So if you want to do that, you are welcome to take a look at either of these links. Will get you straight to those apps. And of course, it's free and fully available, and you don't need an account to sign in. So now I'm going to hand it over to Maria, who is going to talk about cultural responsiveness in acknowledgement systems.
Thank you, Kent. Hi, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon. So like Ken says, I'll be talking about culturally responsiveness and acknowledgement systems, but I want you to think first about a word or a couple of words that come to your mind as you think of describing cultural responsiveness. Take a moment and maybe write in chat if you feel like it, a word or three words that you would use to describe cultural responsiveness. I can share mine. For instance, I think of active learning mainly. I see open awareness. It's getting shared as a word of describing cultural responsiveness. Or understanding the role of culture in education. I see understanding student learning needs and style, inclusivity. Those are all great words and go in alignment with cultural responsiveness according to Geneva Gay, who defines it as using the cultural knowledge or prior experiences, frame of references, and performance styles of ethnically diverse students to make learning encounters more relevant to and effective for them. It teaches to and through the strengths of these students. So a main message is like not just knowing, gaining knowledge and awareness of different cultures, but getting to know your students as individuals and using all of that information to tailor the practices so that these learning opportunities are more engaging for them. I just wanted to share a resource for coaches to use and consider using with their teams or with teachers as you engage folks in this journey of developing awareness of their own identity first, as you're also actively learning about other cultures and thinking about this as a system and how to adapt different elements of it to make it more responsive to your classroom or to your school and its community. I can mention there are going to be some strategies. First of all, I'll be talking about get to know you activities. And you're like, well, but this is an acknowledgement webinar. And that's right. But in order for us to be able to adapt the way that we deliver a strategy, we need to know more about our students. And I'm just showing here a bit.ly link where you can learn more about, in general, get to know you activities. And why do we do this? We know that when we use get to know you activities like strength and interest assessments, we can help understand student perspective. And with that information gathered, we can foster authentic connections and engage students in learning opportunities. When they feel seen, heard, they can also feel acknowledged. Here's an example of what a strength and interest assessment might look like. And as you can see, there's some questions here that are background information, strength information, interest of the student, and support and preferences. And with some of these questions, you might get to learn information that's more, might inform more that surface level adaptations to the delivery of a strategy. If you know the language that's spoken at home, maybe you can acknowledge the student using a phrase in that language if you know one. You can ask them about their own strength. And if you know a student and something that they're good at, that's something that you can intentionally focus on reinforcing in the classroom by acknowledging it when you see it happening. Or vice versa, if the student shares with you something that they want to get good at, that's information for the educator that they can become aware of and target as they're trying to help a student who is actively working on particular pro-social skills. And like that, there's other information as well that you can get. So I just wanted to show you just a range of different questions that can inform different levels of cultural adaptations to acknowledgement systems. And this brings us to our second strategy, which is praise preference assessment. And this can build upon or build on a strength and interest preference assessment in itself. It can be included as part of these surveys. And why would we do it? You know, think about a moment in which, you know, you've been acknowledged and you appreciated it and like the way that it happened. And then think of a time where maybe you were appreciative that you were acknowledged, but you didn't necessarily appreciate the way in which you were acknowledged. So just like us adults, students also will have their own preferences in terms of how they like to be praised, if verbally, if more in private, through a gesture instead of words, or with tangibles, or etc. So it's good to know that about a person and use that when considering how we are acknowledging our students. So what is it? It's really a way to identify the types of acknowledgements the student like and dislike. It can be formatted as a menu of options that the educator can choose from. And it can also be provided or asked in interview formats if you're thinking of specific students instead of getting this information from everyone in your classroom. So I'm going to go quickly over steps for implementation, which are 3. The first one being creating the assessment form. So this is usually just an example where you would add or have your teachers, you would create the time for them to add the space for the student's name and create the menu. Think about what would be acceptable acknowledgement options for them. We provide a link where you can customize the options that for the praise preference assessment. And then you would ask the students to rate the options in itself. They can circle, cross out the ones that they prefer. They can rate them in order of preference, or they might be able to add something that it's not on there necessarily, but it would be a great way to acknowledge the students. So once you have this information as a coach, the important piece to it is to guide your teams and your teachers in the review of this information. So going through a process where first you're reading and maybe listing the options that came up in that classroom that students selected more often, and which options were selected as like the least preferred more often. So there's some information that will inform any change in the way that acknowledgement systems occur, but also reviewing what might be surprising information for the teacher that they didn't expect to read from students or not. So guiding this exercise of reviewing individual responses and class-wide responses so that can be tailored into the delivery of instruction. So big ideas, just like adults, students will like and dislike different types of phrases. And we use these to improve our relationship with students and just creating a more welcoming environment in classrooms by benefiting and changing the systems that you use. And here's the overview of this strategy for you. I know we've been posting certain links on here on the chat as I am going, and they will be made available to you as well on the slide with the slides later on. So in terms of plan praise, the second strategy, plan praise is more of an intentional strategy for the adults and for reminding us how to acknowledge students or groups of students that we know have less positive interactions within the school overall, or that you personally might not have the best relationship, and you know there's more need for creating more positive moments with these students. So when we provide time in a training with teachers, we're really providing a space for teachers to brainstorm a set of possible praise statements or think about what behaviors or values do I want to emphasize when I'm acknowledging a set of students that I know I want to be more intentional with. And why do we do it? We know this is a powerful tool that improves behavior. Because of it, it's effective. So you can use it with all your students, but it might be more strategic and feasible if you're identifying those students who need more positive interactions. So there are 5 steps on how to go about planning praise. And I'll go through these steps. The first one being identifying that group of students that you want to be more intentional with. So that would be the first step that you would guide folks in. And they can identify these by looking at data like ODRs and who have the highest rates or who is more disproportionately identified in disciplinary incident records. You can also think of students that have less connection in the schools and less adults in the schools can think about and share about. So here's an example of this praise plan that's available with the resources, where you would really identify just a few students before moving into other steps, like, for instance, creating a glossary of strengths. So this strategy doesn't necessarily need to be used with a student who is behaving inappropriately in your classroom. You can also adapt it in a way that you can think of their strengths and be intentional with those to interrupt stereotypes that these students are facing regularly in the classroom. So when creating that glossary of strengths, think about what are the behaviors that would be expected from them to do on a daily basis? What are those behaviors that in certain contexts might not be appropriate, but in real life or outside of that moment, there really are good skills to have and use in different ways? And how can you take a strength and really use it to highlight a positive characteristic and affirm that student with acknowledging that piece of their identity or their way of being? So here's an example of how we would identify, like with Andrea is a student who doesn't have any unwanted behavior in particular, but you want to highlight positive pieces to it, and he's good at transitioning quickly. So that would be a strength for you to later on be paying attention. And as opposed to Deshaun, who you're really thinking of the student that you struggle with in terms of the student being more argumentative, or can in the sense that they're really looking to questioning fairness in that moment. And in the classroom, that might be a power struggle. As a quality outside of it, we can really reframe that and see how that is a good or an important social skill to have to look out for others. So as you're developing and identifying or walking your teachers in this process, the next step would be to plan the praise statement. So any evidence-based strategy or practice that we are adapting, we want to make sure that the elements of that evidence-based practice remain intact, in the sense that with a strategy like behavior-specific praise, we want to make sure that it's so contingent and immediate, that's specific and genuine. But we also want to tailor it to the preference of our students. So if you use your praise preference assessments, you would know which ways might be more appropriate to acknowledge that student. And also, how do you pair that up with a school-wide or a class-wide acknowledgement system, so that if the relationship with the adult is diverse, you can use that instead. So going through that thought process, and then really picking a time to use them, depending on the behavior or the strength that you want to emphasize. You know that there are going to be specific routines that students will show that behavior in itself, or they might need more encouragement if engaging in a difficult activity where you would tend to see unwanted behavior instead. And in terms of training, it is important to really anchor this maybe in moments of a lesson plan where it would be appropriate, or it's conducive to being able to increase the amount of praise statements that you use in a classroom. So you would write this in, and as you're wrapping up your planned praise, you would then just go about it and do it and implement it using the praise statement, and monitor how that is going, at least in the first once a day, at least for the first 10 days. And you might vary as needed if you need to expand upon like the behaviors that you are praising. So just things that we've learned so far, if in terms of tips for success, you might want to reach out to family members or other person in the school who would know more about the student if you want to build more on the glossary of strengths. Use a preference assessment to identify what might be more appropriate for that student. the use of a system to help remember. It's going to be important for implementation. So you can use an app like Ken walked us through, or you can encourage the use of visual signals like posters, stickers, or actual notes in the lesson plan. And this would be just the activity that we would walk teachers through in our training that you would want to consider doing with them and have them discuss as a grade level team or just school-wide. And just very briefly looking at time in terms of non-contingent acknowledgement, the importance of creating routines in your classrooms where students are acknowledged, maybe by their peers if that's more appropriate, but also by you, the teacher. So there could be a moment for shout outs or appreciations. And here on the slides are videos that I won't be showing, but are there for you to see, where it can be after a class activity where students are acknowledging their peer, or at the end of the class as they're transitioning, before they transition to the next classroom or yeah, to the next classroom. So
front table shout outs.
This is meant to be like really quick.
She got to work really fast.
A shout out.
In this example, it's more of a high school example.
It's appreciation, apology, or aha.
The classroom routine. And then and also a non-contingent acknowledgement would be a routine of greeting students in the morning and creating that moment where you're greeting them by name, providing them with a positive or neutral statement, and then directing them to the first activity so you continue a momentum as other students are coming in. And this could, there could be variations to a morning routine. You might just have a checking instead, might develop a checking system, or you might set them up in an initial activity and then the teacher walked around the room. So we're going to provide you with more information and different variations, but basically what these strategies have in common is that they're intentional moments in your day with your students to getting to know them and be able to share outside of instruction. So you get more information about them. You're able to then think intentionally back to, oh, I remember more about this student in that way, so I can use what I know about them to present this example or make this comparison that's going to resonate with them. So that's a very quick overview of some strategies. So I'm going to pass it back to Kent and any questions the group might have.
Thank you very much, Maria. Lots of good questions or comments in the chat. So you can find, I've been going through and posting the bit.ly links throughout, so you can find those. The main question we've had so far is, how do we get these slides? And so just so you all know, you'll go to PBIS.org and School Climate Transformation Grant. When the video is complete, that button that you pushed to register for the webinar will turn into a webinar video, and then you will see the slides posted as resources there. So both of those will happen at the same time. And so we'd love to answer your questions. You're welcome to put those into the chat or into the Q&A. We hope this is sort of, excuse me, useful for you all in terms of being able to take a really close look at your acknowledgement systems you have. Are you using them equitably with all student groups? And then are you using them in a way that is, remember, these systems are supposed to be reinforcing, right? And so if the ways that we're using acknowledgement systems are not reinforcing for students, then they're not working. So using that praise preference assessment, getting to know students. So when you have that, where you can be looking out for what information to praise, what behaviors to praise that they would find meaningful. If you know what their goals are, then you pointing out how they're taking steps to meet those goals is a much more authentic way than simply just something broad or generic. All right, so we're gonna keep it open for just a little bit more, so you can go into the Q&A and the chat in there. What we can do is think about some of the questions that people have. Okay, so looking at it specifically, how can I get the Be Positive app? So you can find those on the link, and I will share, or maybe Maria can find and share an article in there specifically. So if you cannot access the bit.ly links in the chat, just copy and paste the link and then paste it into your browser and it'll go. Great, thank you. Thanks for being a team here. Okay, we got one question here. My school has been focusing on employability, career tech high school, in a career tech high school. And I'd love to hear if you have any suggestions for applying this to that concept. I'll answer a little bit, and then I don't know if Maria's got some answers. I think one of the things that's really critical, especially if you're looking at that, is really trying to understand what are your students' career goals? What do they want? What are the positions that they want to have? What are the opportunities that they want to have? And one of the things that we recognize regularly over and over is that employees generally don't lose their jobs because of technical proficiency. They lose their jobs because they can't get along with others, or they can't get along with their supervisors. And so being able to share that information with them and identifying, making, in this case, if you're doing some employability, do a little bit of make your feedback sessions with the students, if it feels right and if it feels authentic, maybe a little bit more of what kind of feedback they'd receive from an employer about their job performance, and be able to kind of role play and rehearse that information. I think that would be useful. Here's another one here. We use tickets as a prompt for praise, and we find that teachers and parents are upset when some students get more, who have more challenging behaviors and are on tier 2 or 3 plans, need access to tier 1 systems. How do we respond other than the fair does not mean equal? You know, this is a pretty consistent thing that we see regularly. And I think for me, one of the things that I think of is, let's not use one system as the thing that we assume fixes it for everybody. So if you've got a really good sort of well-established, well-articulated acknowledgement system, it's not focused on one thing. It's a little bit broader. And so we know that for when you're trying to shape new behavior, that acknowledgement and the reinforcement and the feedback should be as immediate as possible, right away, and really quick. And so that's where the use of quick specific praise, acknowledgement tickets, slightly more tangible, like literally a piece of paper, can be a little bit more helpful. Whereas students who can tolerate a little bit more delay in that reinforcement, one of the things that we can use is different, you know, whether you're doing a student of the week or you're using a student of the month or something like that in there. can be a nice way to be able to recognize students who are regularly doing it. All right. I'm going to go with this question here, an anonymous attendee, and I think maybe Maria will answer this one. What strategy is most effective for high school students who sometimes struggle with buy-in and don't respond to traditional positive specific praise? You got some thoughts on that one, Maria?
Well, what I'm thinking about with high school students that don't appreciate the traditional positive specific praise, it could be something shared privately, but also just thinking of the high school environment and that dynamic. I really do see the value in the starting routines, or like the end of the class routines, where students can acknowledge their peers or something that they observe about them. And that way, there might be something that they didn't realize that they were doing that was helping the other person, or was helpful for X or Y reason, that can be received by the student in a better way than if it comes from their own teacher.
Yeah, and I just really like the idea of asking students how they want to be recognized. We need to do much more of an increase in voice and choice for students. And when students hear what they want to receive, it is incredibly powerful. All right, I will make sure that as we get in that we paste the bit.ly links. They just need the HTTP : // I always forget which one it is, in front of it, and then those should work just fine. One other question, and this is probably going to be our last one before we finish up. Suggestions for strategies to use with students who need tier 2 or tier 3 supports. So number one, I really like that you called out that this is specific for tier 1 classroom supports. And that's intentional, because when we're talking about increasing equity, you cannot tier 2 or tier 3 your way out of it. You really need to focus on tier 1 systems. But your question, of course, is really, really valid too. If you've been doing this work, how do you do 2 and 3? And I think one of the core parts that we think of with it is it need not look the same or be the same for everyone. But more often than not, when we think about tier 2 or tier 3 supports, we think about more frequent opportunities for positive feedback, or just any kind of feedback about their instruction. So using a daily report card, like a check-in, check-out card, where students know that at regular points throughout the morning, throughout the afternoon, that they're going to get some positive attention, some acknowledgement for their effort from their classroom teacher, or from the teacher in the class that they're in, is a really, really helpful thing. Sometimes we think that a quick nonverbal acknowledgement can be really, really helpful at tier 1. It's really, really useful at tiers 2 and 3 to be able to really describe the behavior it was that you're acknowledging. Whereas, for students broadly tier 1, a fist tap may work, but some students may signal to us that they need to know exactly what it was that they got to get that bump. And so that's where using that behavior specific praise is really, really useful. All right. So with that, really appreciate the questions that you've had. We really do want you to actually use the things that we suggest. So if you're watching this with your colleagues, if you're watching this as a grade level team or as a school team, please think about identifying what is the one thing at least that you're going to do differently with your acknowledgement. And it might be looking at assessing and increasing equity and acknowledgement. It might be taking a deep dive in the cultural responsiveness of your acknowledgement systems. But whatever it is, please do take something. Don't just watch this and leave. Thank you. And like I said, the video will be posted on the school climate transformation grant topic. When the way you'll be able to tell is it'll change from saying webinar, which is the link to register, to webinar video. And that's where it'll be. So we will encode that, and then we'll make sure to get your handout out along with it. So you'll see those slides and you'll be able to click right through on the bit.ly links. So on behalf of Maria, on behalf of Austin, on behalf of the Center on PBIS Equity Work Group, and on behalf of the Center on PBIS, we thank you very much for your time, and go out and up those praise to corrections ratios, and you might find out that you get more praise back at the end too. All right, take care, everybody. This officially ends the webinar.